Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 141 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Phyllis Fagell for this episode. And Phyllis just released a brand new book. It's called Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens in Turbulent Times. And we haven't specifically talked about middle schoolers on this show before. And I know that Phyllis is just the right person to tackle this with. She's a parenting author and a speaker. And I had to laugh when I saw on her website, she says, Phyllis has lived through middle school 3 times, first for herself, then with her kids, and now as a counselor. She is a school counselor in Washington, D.C., and her first book, Middle School Matters, could be likened to that old book series, What to Expect, in this case, What to Expect When You're Expecting a Middle Schooler. So before we just jump into my discussion with Phyllis about her new book, Middle School Superpowers, I wanted to let you guys know some exciting news from here. The Widowed Parent Institute is going to be launching in September. And so the Widowed Parent Institute brings clear, practical information, resources, and support to moms and dads who are raising grieving kids and teens. And so if you've been around here for a while, you will know this is already what we do. But starting in September, we will be doing more. So if you missed the announcement on Instagram, be sure you're following us at Widowed Parent Institute over there. And stay tuned because I can't wait to share all of it with you very soon. And in the meantime, we are looking for writers of personal essays and book reviews and more. So head on over to our website, widowedparentinstitute.com, to learn more about that. And again, be sure you're following us on Instagram at Widowed Parent Institute. And you can also find us on your other favorite social media channels. All right, that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Phyllis Fagell. Phyllis is a licensed clinical professional counselor, a certified professional school counselor, a journalist, and the author of the best-selling book, Middle School Matters. She's a counselor at Sheridan School in Washington, D.C., and provides therapy to children and teens in private practice. Phyllis is also the author of the brand new book out this week called Middle School Superpowers. She's joining us today from Bethesda, Maryland. Phyllis, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've really been looking forward to this. Listeners will know I've said this before. I really like to interview parenting experts as sort of a special topic on the show. I think that, separately from the grief experts I talk to, those of us who are widowed parents are still plain old parents. And we probably have kids who are dealing with all sorts of childhood things completely unrelated to grief, plus all the grief stuff. And we've talked about teenagers with Lisa D'Amour, and we also talked specifically about girls with Lisa. We talked about avoiding helicopter parenting with Julie Lithcott-Hames and avoiding substance abuse with Jess Leahy. And I'll put links in the show notes to all of those in case you guys missed those. But we have
some of my favorites too.
Yes. You guys are all so terrific. We haven't talked specifically about middle schoolers yet. So this is great. I knew you would be just the person to talk to about this. I've seen you writing and speaking on this topic in your new book, of course. I had to laugh when I saw on your website. It said something like Phyllis has lived through middle school 3 times, first for herself and then for her kids, and now as a school counselor.
It's true. My last kid finally finished middle school last year, and I was actually a little sad because I think it's a pretty great phase. It's not the easiest, but it's so much fun, and they are the funniest humans on the planet.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, and so Middle School Matters, your first book, your brand new book, Middle School Superpowers. So let's just jump right in here. I think you tee it up perfectly in the introduction to your book. You say something like, conventional wisdom is that middle school will inevitably steal even the most confident child's mojo. So I'm wondering, what are some of the developmental features and social features of being a middle schooler that you think make this time particularly challenging?
Middle school is often the time that you're taken out of a very familiar environment and thrust into an entirely new world, often a large middle school where none of the adults know you. Maybe you're suddenly taking a bus and going a farther distance. The academic difficulty increases. There's a tremendous amount of social churn and shifting friendships. And you are going through all of that at the same time that you are in the throes of puberty. Your brain is not fully developed. You are experiencing all of your emotions on a 10. Most of the setbacks or even perceived slights you experience, you haven't experienced before. So you have no way of knowing you're going to survive them. And it can feel like an eternity. But what I always tell parents is that even though we might have our own negative memories of middle school, it is objectively not a worse time of life than other phases. It's just that we are at an age when we're going through them, when we have all of those characteristics that I just shared, and you're acutely aware of how you stack up to others.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you mentioned, I think, the brain development. And this was an interesting point that listeners maybe people already know this. I didn't understand. I always think of puberty as being kind of the body upgrades, the body changes. And it was in one of the interviews, it might have been with Lisa D'Amour, where I really understood for the first time the brain upgrades of puberty are as significant, if not more so, than the body upgrades.
Yes. And it's not like you suddenly start going through puberty when you get your period or when your voice drops. You're actually starting to go through that process, which when you're much younger, only it's happening internally. Mm-hmm. I always think that third grade is like the first seventh grade. There can be as much drama then as there is later because they get a big rush of hormones. And so there's the visible changes and then there are the invisible changes. And there is no time that you are changing faster or more in life other than ages from birth to age 2. So in middle school, you're changing as faster than any other time other than birth to age 2.
Wow, that's crazy. That's when you put it that way. Yeah. Because everybody knows the difference between a 0-year-old and a 2-year-old is huge.
Yes.
And wow. Okay. So the second most rapid time of changing bodies and brains is that puberty period. Interesting. Okay. And that happens to squarely coincide with this middle school period.
Yes. So just as you're having all of those internal and external changes to your brain, to your body, you're also experiencing them in your friendships. You're also starting to pull away from parents. I always tell parents that your child isn't embarrassed by you. They're embarrassed to be with you. And that's so true.
Let's understand that. Okay, wait, your child isn't embarrassed by you. They're embarrassed to be, what did you say? Can you tell us again?
Yes, they're not embarrassed by you. They're embarrassed to be with you. And it's an important distinction because if you think they're embarrassed by you, you're likely to personalize the fact that they don't want you, say, to go to the football game at the high school with them or to be seen saying goodbye. I love the scene in the animated movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse where Miles Morales, who's the main character, is 13. His father's a police officer and he drops him off at school and he says, "Love you," to his son as he's getting out of the car. And Miles kind of shrugs and doesn't say anything. And he takes out the megaphone, the police megaphone, and says, "Say, I love you, Miles." And Miles hears it with all of his friends around him and it's reverberating in his head, which so perfectly captures this idea that it's not that you don't want to say, "I love you" to your father. Or it's not that you don't want to be with your parent. It's that you don't want to be with them or say you love them in front of your peers. You want to be independent. You want to feel grown up.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So while we're talking about superheroes, then you mentioned Spider-Man there. Your book is based on this concept of superpowers. And now listeners can't see that I'm holding up the book here. Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens in Turbulent Times, which, yes, we want resilient tweens and we definitely have turbulent times. So what do you mean by superpowers? What are we talking about here?
So when I wrote Middle School Matters, which was meant to be sort of like a what to expect when you're expecting a middle schooler, a survey of all the different things that they might experience, whether it's conflict over homework or screen time, or simply making the transition to middle school, or learning how to write an email to a teacher, or navigating a broken heart. All of those things that parents have come to expect, I tried to cover in Middle School Matters. And then the pandemic hit. And we suddenly found ourselves thrust into this time of intense cultural division. We had this huge uptick in school violence and school shootings in society. I was seeing kids in private practice and in the school setting who were really struggling with anxiety. We had this corresponding spike in mental health disorders that even the American Academy of Pediatrics was calling a national crisis. And I realized that we needed a whole new set of skills. And so that's where this second book came from. I really tried to figure out, we now have these extreme tweens. That's what I've been calling them. The same old middle schoolers, only more so. Everything that you think about, whether it's developing empathy or having trouble self-regulating and dealing with difficult emotions, all of those things that are characteristic of the developmental phase are more so because of all of the things going on in the outside world. And as a result, I felt like I needed to write this second book. And there are 12 superpowers or strengths that are teachable, that we can use the normal bumps of middle school, whether it's feeling like a friend group is rejecting them, or a parent gets a divorce, or there's a loss in the family, or simply just the instability of living in a difficult time. I identified these 12 superpowers that I think are effective with these extreme tweens and have been with the extreme tweens that I've been working with in the school and clinical setting. And my hope is that if we have found these universal social emotional strategies that work for these extreme tweens, I'm hopeful that they will actually help tweens in calmer times, more typical.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. And, I was thinking, some of the things you mentioned there reminded me that even though this book isn't specifically about grief and death losses, of course, it's about middle school and all the middle school stuff that might come up. It strikes me that some of the example scenarios that you give in the book might actually be things that could happen as a result of losing parents, like switching to a new school, moving to a new town, dealing with friendship dynamics and the changes and weirdness there. Those are all things that could kind of be spin-offs of losing a parent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, it's additive, and stress is additive. So if you've lost a parent, and then on top of that, you're going through all those external and internal changes we were talking about, plus you have to change schools, it stands to follow that you probably are going to have a harder time coping than someone who doesn't have quite as much on their plate to handle.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Which underscores the importance for those of us who are parents in kind of upping our parenting game, or, increasing our knowledge. I don't know, thinking about this, talking about this, like learning and figuring out how we can support our kids in the best that we can.
Absolutely. And that's actually, with middle schoolers, one of the more complicated things to do, because it seems like they don't want you around. And it's not because they don't want to be with you. It's that they don't want to be seen with you.
Right.
And figuring out how to reach them and how to teach them these skills and how to support them and coach them in a way that doesn't leave them feeling managed or criticized or judged is really that magic sauce for being able to stay in there and parent them through this difficult phase. And I think a lot of parents, because it's a difficult phase, because it seems like they don't want to talk as much, instead take a giant step back. And that's not what you want to be doing. You want to be taking that step forward, but doing it in a way that respects their growing need for autonomy, that honors who they are, that allows them to be uneven with you and make mistakes, because they're so hypersensitive, especially now.
Yeah. This reminds me, I really love this analogy. As we start talking about this, resilience is not something you're born with, such as an ear for music or an ear for world languages. It's something you mentioned in your book. And I had never thought of it quite that way, but I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about resilience. If you're not born with it, okay. I think where you're going maybe is that we as parents have a role in helping our kids somehow become or learn or somehow to be resilient.
Yes, I think there isn't a parent on the planet who doesn't want to shield their kids from all discomfort. That is in our DNA. If somebody hurts our kid, we want to stick daggers in that person's eyes. If our kids are suffering, we wish we could take it for them. And as much as we want to do that, we can't anyway. this is something that we can't shield them from. But what we can do is actually even more powerful and is a longer lasting gift. And that's to teach them how to recover when they experience those setbacks, when they take the hits. I love the analogy that a researcher in Wisconsin shared with me. He talked about how it used to be that when you took your baby to the pediatrician, you would put your infant on the table. The doctor would give the infant their vaccine, their shot, and then they would return the baby to the parents' arms to comfort and to help them settle down. And they don't do that anymore. Now what they do is they have the parent hold the baby the whole time. The shot is the same. Physiologically, it should be the same. The needle size is the same. But when they measure their physiological response, their heart rate, their cortisol, their stress response, they actually don't get as distressed. So the parent is a buffer, not a fixer. They're not preventing them from getting that shot or that insult or getting broken up with or dumped by a friend or cut from a sports team, but they're there to comfort them and to help them take steps to move forward, to feel less like a passive victim of fate, which is such a part of loss in particular. You just don't feel any sense of control, and to give them back that sense of control. And there are a lot of different ways that parents can do that. And that is one of the ingredients in resilience.
Interesting. Okay. I love that analogy. That's interesting. All right. So on these superpowers, so each chapter is basically diving into a different superpower, drawing on research, stories, your professional experience to kind of unpack each one of these. Can you give us a couple of examples? Like, what are some of these superpowers that we're even talking about here? Yes.
So super belonging, which is about, finding your place in the pack and feeling that sense of belonging. Some of the other ones are super flexibility, which is the power to manage change and uncertainty, which is partially related to loss, but also can be related to the loss of childhood too. A lot of kids feel a sense of melancholy about going through puberty, about having to leave that part of life behind where they were playing with dolls and stuffed animals, especially if other friends are moving ahead faster. And they still like their Legos, and they still feel like a really little kid inside. So that can be part of the challenge.
Okay.
Super bounce is the power to learn and recover from missteps. Super agency, which is what we were talking about a minute ago when it comes to resilience. It's that power to find your purpose and take initiative. Super security has to do with taking pride in your identity at a time when you're figuring out who you are and trying to figure out if you're good enough as you are. Parents can play a big role in that as well. And there are several more. And the last one that I include is super optimism, the power to find hope and humor in the hard stuff. Because again, resilience isn't about not experiencing hard things. It's about finding ways to keep putting one foot in front of the other when hard things happen.
Oh, that's so interesting. Putting one foot in front of the other. That reminds me, I should find a link to this. Listeners might want to see it. I don't know if you saw this interview that Stephen Colbert did with Joe Biden after Joe Biden's son died of brain cancer, which happened to be the same brain cancer that my husband had. And Stephen Colbert said, "How do you do it? How do you keep going every day?" And Biden said something like, "I just get up and I put one foot in front of the other day after day after day." I haven't watched it in a while.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I think that people think there's some magical, resilient unicorn 7th grader who, when they take a hit, no matter how big it is, somehow life is still full of glitter and everything is fine. And really the only difference between the kid who seems to be functioning well and the kid who's really stuck is that they have the skills and the tools to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Their pain is still there for them as well.
And as you said that, I'm thinking, I wonder if some of that are we thinking back to our own middle school days and thinking, oh, well, there were those cool kids who seemed to have it all together. And there must be, some of them out there. Everybody else is that way. And maybe they really weren't as put together as we thought.
Yes. And as a school counselor, one of the things I can say with a lot of authority is that often the kids who have the popularity, and that is real power, having social capital is real power, it comes with a lot of stress, keeping up your image, feeling like you have to jockey to stay in that position. You might be more likely to be surrounded by fair weather friends because everybody is stepping on the heads of the people below them to keep that status. They're actually not happier. The happiest kids are the ones who are possibly out to left or right field, and they found a couple of people who they can really be themselves with and be authentic. They don't have to twist themselves into a pretzel to fit in. There's an ease to the relationships. I did say, though, I did share the research on that with a kid once, that the popular kids are not necessarily the happiest. And this kid looked at me and said, "No offense, Miss Fagell, but I'm going to have to see that research."
Well, and so our kid's great, right? This is a kid whose brain is upgrading, who's like, they're on it, right?
They don't miss a beat. They're really funny.
Yeah. Well, and this reminds me, actually, if any of the listeners are on Twitter, you might want to follow Phyllis on Twitter, because she posts all these little observations from her day as a school counselor. A 6-year-old said this, and a 7-year-old said this in response, or, the 12-year-old asked me this and I asked them back. I don't know. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Well, the one you just gave actually is probably something you may have shared on Twitter.
I tried to include them at the top of the chapters in this book, at least the middle school ones. One of my other favorite ones was the student who said to me, this was an 8th grade girl, and she said, I need accommodations when I take tests, like a 504 plan or an IEP. And or at least that's what I was thinking. And I said to her, "What kind of accommodations do you need?" And she said, "Easier questions."
There you go. Asking for what she wants.
Yes. Yeah. Witty and also very wise.
There you go. All right. Well, so follow Phyllis for some interesting anecdotes. And I think it's fun, but it's also, I think it gives a window into what's on kids' minds these days.
Yes. Some of them I share not because they're funny, but just because they're poignant. And I think as adults, it's easy to think that because problems seem small to us, that they're small problems. And with middle school kids, one thing I always underscore and emphasize for parents is that the big stuff, losing a parent, the big stuff is the big stuff, but the small stuff is the big stuff too. I will never forget right before we left to go to virtual learning. It was probably March 11th or 12th. We knew what was coming and the world was about to shut down. And there were news reports from here to Italy that there was no sanitizer to be found. We all felt like the world was about to end. And that last day I went to school, there was a note on my desk and it was from a boy. And he had written, "Miss Fagell, the next time we have health class, can you please explain to the 7th graders why pimples happen?" So if we want to support our kids, we have to make sure that we are not dismissive of what seems like a small problem, that we show the same empathy for the little stuff as we do for the big stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. That's an important point. I want to dive into a few of these superpowers and explore a couple of them. You have a chapter on setting boundaries, and I know boundaries are a very popular topic these days. You see articles about it. You see advice columns about it. People are talking about boundaries, and I'm wondering, what do you call this superpower, and why is this important, and why is it important for our middle school age kids to learn about boundaries? So how can we help them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The superpower is super force field. And, just riffing off superhero imagery a little bit, but really it is a bona fide superpower, because when you're in middle school, you have been told your whole life to be kind, to be a good person. And so if a friend comes to you with a problem that's too big for you to handle, or they're overwhelming you by crying and demanding a lot of your time when maybe you're going through some stuff yourself, it doesn't feel like you can tell them that you want to go to sleep, or that it's over your level of, beyond your level of expertise. And kids really need us to give them permission. Sometimes an excuse, they can blame it on us, that their parents said they had to put their phone away, to back away. And also to really understand that sometimes not only are you, the kid, not able to help them, you might actually be getting in the way of them getting the kind of support that they need, meaning a professional therapist or someone who can really support them through this big crisis that they're going through. But to use a less extreme example, I was talking to a psychologist. His name is Ryan DeLapp, and he was sharing a story of an 8th grade girl who was having a really hard time because a friend would sit next to her in class because she was smart and she would copy her homework and get academic support in class. But this person wouldn't talk to her in the hallways or make plans with her. And she felt used, but she didn't feel like she could tell this girl that she couldn't have her homework or that she felt used because she thought this girl would think she was mean or not a nice person. And we as parents, and this is more typical with girls than boys, girls tend to do a lot of the emotional labor. So especially moms can do a lot to reinforce for our daughters in particular that you cannot give from an empty vessel, and you can still be helpful. You can say, that sounds really hard. Are you talking to an adult about this? You can be the bridge who helps them get that support. You can report to an adult if there's something concerning that someone says, but you are out of your depth. If you, as an impaired 8th grader or 7th grader, and all 7th and 8th graders are dealing with a lot, are trying to take on the emotional burdens of a friend who's really struggling mightily.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's important for parents to understand that in this middle school age group, which feels fairly young to me for this to be happening, there are 7th graders going to other 7th graders saying, I'm cutting, but don't tell anyone.
Yes.
I'm thinking about killing myself, but you better not tell anybody. Any kinds of extremely difficult and serious things like that, that middle schoolers are confiding in other middle schoolers, and then the one that receives the information is in a terrible spot. And so first of all, I want people to know this, but secondly, do you have any advice? Like, how can we coach our kids around this topic, or what should we be doing?
So there are 2 things that parents can do. The first is to flat out tell them that if a friend comes to you and they want to talk about something that's normal middle school drama, you need a date to the dance, you're not sure what to wear, you are aggravated with your brother, whatever it might be, sure, jump in, support them as much as you can. Don't lose sleep over it, because you need to get your rest and you don't want to spend all of your time helping one person anyway. But if they come to you with a problem that feels too big for you, and you can even define that for them, if they tell you they're cutting, or they have an eating disorder, or they're getting abused or neglected, if they're having suicidal thoughts, or they're telling you they're going to give away their belongings, anything that falls into that category, one of those categories, big categories, you want to be helping them get an adult involved. And you never promise not to tell, because you may actually be putting them at risk by keeping that secret. That's not the kind of secret you want to be holding. And then on the flip side, so that you're protecting your own kid, if they're the one who is going through a really hard time and they're tempted to go to a fellow 8th grader or 7th grader or 6th grader, you want to be having a conversation with them in advance where you say to them, if you were in a crisis, who is the adult you would go to for support? And you want to do that for a few reasons. 1, you want to normalize asking for help. Number 2, you want an opportunity to say, it doesn't have to be me, your parent. Number 3, you want them also to be making that call when they are calm, when they're not in crisis. And you want an opportunity to brainstorm with them if they can't think of anyone, so that it's something they can quickly retrieve when they're in that situation. And then the third thing I would say to share with kids is that, because the research shows that when a child is at risk of self-harm, it's far more likely that you'll catch that person before it's too late if a child says something than an adult, to make sure they understand that as kids, they might be the first person, or they're likely to be the first person to hear that. They shouldn't assume that that person is also telling an adult, even if they don't say don't tell. So parents want to be talking to other parents. Kids should be sharing information when there's something concerning, because that's our best shot at actually catching a kid before they do something that is not fixable.
Okay. So thank you for talking us through that. And I think that the social dynamic makes, which I think you alluded to, but it makes this extra hard, right? Like when the one kid tells the other kid, I'm cutting or I have an eating disorder or I'm being abused, etc. But don't tell anyone. The kid who's received the information is now petrified, like the kid's going to hate me, or all my friends are going to hate me, or I'm going to be labeled a snitch, or some kind of social ostracization. I don't think I said that right. Anyway, ostracizing behavior is going to happen. I don't know, like, I guess, do parents just tackle that head on? Like, how, I don't know. How do we guide our kids on that?
There's a few things that I think are helpful to share with kids, and one has to do with peer influence and this idea of peer pressure. So when I was growing up, it was all about this coercive idea of peer pressure. Someone would tell you to smoke or they wouldn't be your friend, which of course, wasn't really how it works. It's behavior contagion. And if something is a norm in your environment and it's endorsed by the popular people in your environment, you're likely to endorse it as well to preserve your place in that pack. But when you actually drill down, it turns out that a lot of times it's unpopular norms that are getting endorsed because nobody wants to be rejected. But I would reassure your child that they're probably overestimating the social risk, that most people, and I think they would logically come to the same conclusion, would understand why you would go to an adult if you were really worried about a friend's well-being. That even if there's this other norm that you don't snitch, you don't tell someone, middle schoolers are sophisticated enough to understand that there are exceptions and self-harm would fall into that category.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Would you rather be responsible for saving a life or for preserving your friendship with somebody who probably doesn't have the same priorities as you anyway?
Yeah. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Thank you. I'm not sure which superpower this falls under, but this topic of building agency in kids. And you talk about making a Venn diagram with 2 circles. Can you tell us more about this, and where does this fall in the superpower scheme?
So super agency is really about giving kids back a sense of ownership of their destiny, because we know that depression is in part related to that sense that things are happening to you and there's nothing you can do. Optimists see things as situational and specific, whereas pessimists see things as pervasive and permanent. And one of the ways to raise an optimistic kid who has that sense of agency is to teach them to be proactive, to teach them to find ways that they can take whatever life has handed them, good, bad, indifferent, and take some small action that gives them back that sense of control. So maybe you weren't invited to a party with your close group of friends and you feel like you were rejected by all of them. So we can't undo that. But what can you do? You can maybe call another friend, maybe somebody who you know is looking for friends themselves. You can have an individual sleepover with someone who was invited to that party, just to remind yourself that just because the one person who's hosting it didn't invite you doesn't mean everyone there wouldn't have wanted to have you there.
Sure.
So really giving them back that sense of ownership. In the chapter in the book, I share a lot of examples of real life kids who've done things to either make a difference or to advocate for things like removing the stigma in mental health, anything that can give kids a sense in this age group that they matter and can make a difference, and they don't have to passively accept what life has handed to them, is to build their sense of competency, build their confidence, build their optimism, give them a path forward, help them put that one foot in front of the other.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That makes sense. And so the Venn diagram, I think.
Oh, yeah. The Venn diagrams and that's related to the fact that everybody's stamina is down. You could pick up every battle if you wanted. So the way I explain it to kids is there are things you can control, things you can't control, and there are things that really matter. And you want to be focusing on the things that you can control and that matter. So for example, if you're a kid who is docked a point on a quiz that is 1% of 1% of your grade, and you deserved that point, sure, you can go talk to the teacher and make a big stink out of it and probably also get that point back. But does it really matter? Is that where you want to put your energy? Will there be some unanticipated outcomes of doing that? Might it annoy the teacher? So we want them to be thinking about how they want to be distributing their energy, because they don't have endless energy. Most of them can't manage quite as many activities as they could pre-pandemic. They fatigue more easily. They're still getting used to having a million interactions a day, which is just what middle school is ordinarily anyway.
Right.
Even though we're, theoretically on the other side of the pandemic, they're still really working on their social skills and working on their stamina.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Speaking of relating to kids, and you were talking a while ago about, kids not wanting to be seen by us. And there was a sentence that jumped out at me. I think it was in the chapter called super healing, which I don't know which superpower that is. But anyway, a teenager said about her mother, or to her mother, when you connect on the simple, relatable things, you lay the groundwork for talking about the bigger stuff. And I thought that was an important and interesting point.
So that goes back to what I was talking about with the big stuff is the big stuff and the small stuff is the big stuff. Mm-hmm. And that story that I shared in Super Healing, and Super Healing is the power to self-regulate emotions and cope. Okay. And that story was a girl who was reflecting back on 8th grade. And her name is Sophia. And when Sophia was in 8th grade, she went to a dance at another school, and she had just changed schools herself. And part of the reason she had changed schools was because kids were unkind in her last school. And even though kids had been unkind and she was moving forward, she had some ambivalence about leaving those friends behind because she hadn't yet made new friends in the new environment.
Right.
And when she went to this dance that was with a friend from the old school, plus people from lots of different schools, she overheard some of her old friends, the ones who hadn't been so nice, making fun of a girl across the room, making fun of what she was wearing. And she felt that sinking, awful feeling. It just sort of brought back everything for her. And when she went home, she got into bed with her mom and cried. She was still in her makeup and her shoes. And her mom didn't dismiss that feeling she was having. In fact, the mom shared a story about her own childhood when she was dumped by a friend group or felt like she was not happy in a friend group. And the takeaway was that her mom wasn't going to belittle how she felt. Fast forward to Super Healing, when she was older, when she was a sophomore in high school, and she had a mental health crisis, and her mom handled it really well. Her mom said to her, I feel like I did a pretty good job with this at 16, and I wish I had done a better job back in middle school. And Sophia's response was, no, like, you were perfect in middle school because you didn't belittle the things that might have seemed silly or inconsequential, but were big to me. You treated it all as consequential. And that was why I was able to go to you later. I had a big problem.
Interesting point. Okay. All right. And that's an important point. And I think it relates to, one of the things we talk about on the show is the importance of being honest with kids about these difficult things too. And like honest, sometimes people, if somebody dies by suicide, they maybe tell them it was a heart attack or something because they think it's too hard to tell them that it was suicide. But eventually, and actually, I first heard about this from Lauren Schneider at Our House Grief Support Center in Los Angeles, who I was very happy to notice that you mentioned in the book as a resource, which is terrific. She talked about how that relationship between the bond of trust between the surviving parent and the child is so important. And if the kid is feeling like you lied to them about this important fact, eventually they find out, and that bond of trust is damaged. And this is reminding me of the situation you're talking about. It's a little bit the inverse, maybe, where in your example, the parent is building the bond of trust and openness by nailing these smaller things consistently.
Yes. No, I love that. And it's really hard to listen as an adult, but especially in middle school, kids so desperately want to feel respected. And there's Adam Cox, there's a psychologist who always says, talk to kids as if they're a little bit older and more mature than they are in this age group. And that's consistent with the advice you got from Our House to really be honest with kids. I also happen to believe that the truth tends to come out anyway in general.
Yeah.
And so you're better off being straightforward and then helping kids, again, buffering them, helping them process that information. And they may need to process it differently depending on their age and they may need to reprocess it as they get older, but rather than shield them from it entirely, to at least be honest in what you disclose to them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And if anybody is in Los Angeles and listening, I'll encourage you to call our House Grief Support Center. They have some terrific programs there. And actually, there are programs like theirs in many communities across the country. If you're not in Los Angeles, I'll put a link in the show notes too, because there, you can look up with your zip code and find something near you, which is I think a great resource for listeners here. Gosh, we could keep talking about this all day. Maybe I'll just round up with a couple more maybe practical sort of questions. You give some tips, which I thought this was terrific, mining school newsletters and social media feeds for clues about things that you might want to talk to your kids about. Can you tell us about this?
So I share the quote in the book from my own kid. I said, "What did you do in PE at school today?" I was trying to be very specific so that I would get some kind of a real answer. Boys in particular tend to be reluctant to share much in middle school. And he said, "I ran." And I said, "Could you expand on that?" And he said, "Around the track," which is perfect. It just sums up middle school in a sentence. So if you have one of those kids who is talking in elementary school and suddenly shuts down, you want to use your resources. And often schools are giving some little nuggets in their social media feeds that allow you to probe without being prying into their personal life, which might just shut them down.
And so I think you had an example of you see maybe they had an assembly on a certain topic or something, then it gives you an opening to ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Okay, great. So all those emails that come in from the principal that we might just skim, we have another reason to read them now. We can be thinking about like, okay, is there something in here I can pull out to open an interesting discussion? All right, cool. That's a good idea. And then also you said sometimes parents ask you when they should seek professional help for their kids. You talked about how a parent asked you something like, when should I be worried enough to take my kid to the pediatrician or a mental health professional? And your answer was?
Yes. I was joking a little bit, but usually parents' intuition is pretty good. If you're worried enough to be asking the question, I would get an evaluation from a professional. It might be the pediatrician. You can consult the school counselor. You can collect data from various people who know your child well, whether it's a neighbor or a coach, a teacher at school, an administrator. But really, you're looking for signs that some part of their daily life is really off. They're not sleeping, or they're sleeping too much. They're not eating, or they're eating all the time. They have stopped taking joy out of activities they once loved. They have so much social phobia, they won't even engage with other kids. Their anxiety is so acute, they won't go to school. They have complete school avoidance. So when you see one of those big red flags, or they're cutting or talking about self-harm, those are all, of course, obvious situations when you want to be getting some extra professional support. But again, trust your instincts. If you're not sure, err on the side of getting an evaluation. And I always say to kids and to parents to tell their kids, you can feel better. You deserve to feel better. There are people who can support you with this, as opposed to you need some help. You're in bad shape. So that you're in it with them, and it's just another tool in their toolbox.
Gotcha. Okay. It's all in the framing of that.
Yeah. And I will just add to that, sometimes we go straight to therapy, and that's actually not what they need. They may be presenting as anxious because they have ADHD and they need some help with executive functioning, or they may need to work with a speech pathologist to really accurately interpret other people's feedback because they're struggling with social interactions. So thinking more broadly, could be an occupational therapist who would provide the right support. It's not necessarily a psychotherapist that they need. Could be a different source of support.
Yes. And continuing those examples, in the case of a child who's lost a parent, a grief support center, many of them don't actually do therapy, quote unquote. They're providing peer grief support groups and activities and all kinds of support that's not therapy, but that can be extremely useful.
Yes. And I can also share as a school counselor that whether it's a grief group or parents have split up, and I run banana splits groups when there's enough kids who are interested to deal with issues related to things like taking your belongings between houses or fighting parents. Any kind of situation where you might, as a child, feel alone or an outlier because it feels like no one else is going through the same thing. A grief group is just incredibly powerful, or a group for whatever the issue happens to be.
Right. Feeling I'm not the only weird kid who has X problem.
Yeah. One of my most popular groups is Worry Busters. And Worry Busters is simply to be around other kids who might be relentlessly self-critical or struggling with normal levels of anxiety, not clinical anxiety. They're just, everything seems a little bit harder. And simply hearing other kids share that they too have this reel in their head of terrible, terrible self-judgment can help them realize, okay, this is not helpful to me. And I wouldn't talk that way to a friend. And often the people in the group will bend over backwards to make the person who is self-critical feel better about themselves. So it has all of these ripple effects that support the kid who's dealing with something.
Yeah. I get the sense from our discussion here and from all the examples in your book that the kids in your school are incredibly lucky to have you there as their school counselor.
I feel lucky because it is incredibly fun to be around kids all day and to get to have a window into their lives and just be part of whatever they're going through is super rewarding for the adults in the building too.
Yeah, terrific. All right, well, I'll mention that there's a resource list in the back of your book, chapter by chapter, so if people want to dive in to those, and a parent discussion guide, which is pretty lengthy, and I'm almost envisioning, Mom's book club, like, let's talk about chapter 3 this week, and Phyllis has some questions for us. And, if you dived into that with your girlfriends and had an honest chat, that could be pretty enlightening.
That's actually the reason I did it, is because I made a parent discussion guide in Middle School Matters that ended up creating so many different book groups. There's an educator version of it as well, so people could do it in schools. But I love it when there are school home partnerships too. Yeah. And you're hearing both of those voices in those book clubs. Parents need support too as their kids are going through middle school. It's not that they definitely have a drop in happiness themselves. It's a lot of change, and it's hard to be vicariously experiencing middle school sometimes through your kids. So that discussion guide is really as a way to support the parents, because when you support the parents, you're also supporting the kids.
Definitely. Gosh, I think we could keep talking all day. There's just so much to share with us, but I think we had better wrap it up here. So I always like to ask my guests at the end one final question to leave us with some parting thoughts. If you could say one thing to widowed parents about raising middle schoolers, what would you say?
First of all, enjoy it. And second of all, make it clear to your child that you expect highs and lows, that you expect unevenness, that you do not imagine that they're somehow going to get through middle school without ever lying or flunking a test or doing something dumb. Sharing your own experiences of doing some of the same. Not telling them doesn't shield them from making those mistakes, by the way. What it does is it makes it safer for them to come to you when they encounter one of those situations themselves, as opposed to lie about it or come up with a maladaptive coping mechanism to deal with it instead.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you. And I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Phyllis Fagell, author of the brand new book, Middle School Superpowers. So Phyllis, where can listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
I have a website, phyllisfagell.com, with my email and a lot of my articles. And feel free to reach out. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook. My handle is @pfagell, Fagell. And the books are on anywhere books are.
Great. All right. We'll be sure to put links to all of that in the show notes. And Phyllis, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Phyllis Fagell as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 141. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.